It's pretty straightforward, isn't it? It's just a bit of messing and let's get away to Strawberry Fields. A bit of messing and let's get away to Strawberry Fields. It's just, it's fantastic to me maybe at certain points when you're doing it. And then after that you can't listen to it objectively. And it takes till about now, say, to really listen to it and understand what you're really talking about.
Can't get out of my bed. There's a thought crime running through my head. Can't take these rules, and people are fools who believe what they read and believe what they see, believe what they see on the TV. Opinions are like iPhones. Everybody.
Hello, welcome to episode 21 of Glass Onion on John Lennon, and today I present to you something slightly different. It's a talk I did, a two-parter, as is normal with this podcast, with Philip Kirkland, who's the author of a new book called All Roads Lead to Lennon, which is about John Lennon's ancestry. So, as Philip points out, it's not a Beatles or a John Lennon book per se, but it does take us up to around 1962, up to the point where John became famous. So some of the stories towards the end of the book do involve John himself, and they will feature in the second part of this talk. But the first part is his ancestors, like I say. But really, you are getting a little bit of John, because you can see in some of the stories and everything what is to come with John Lennon himself when he enters the picture of his family. Now, what you just heard there was John himself, of course, talking about Strawberry Fields in a fairly sort of flippant way, really. I think he was talking to Kenny Everett in 1967, and him and Kenny tended to have sort of light-hearted sort of discussions with, a little bit of wordplay and stuff, and he never really went deep. But in the Playboy interview of 1980, he really did go deep, and I've heard the audio of that once. I'm quite curious to see when I hear little bits of the audio of that interview on other podcasts and other places, I always wonder where they've got it from, because I've never been able to find it. But he really does a much deeper analysis, and some people will know, of course, the basic story is nobody I think is in my tree. Am I crazy or am I a genius, or both perhaps? And the idea that he always felt different. The reason I include that is because Philip is going to tell us during our talk and his book about Strawberry Field, which we'll talk about the name later, but there was a couple of changes there, subtle changes to the name connected with the song. Just want to comment on a couple of other things that are sort of happening in Beatle land. So we had the revelation, in quotes, because it wasn't really too much of a revelation. Mark Lewison's doing this kind of tour called Hornsey Road around Britain. And from what I've heard, it's a great presentation, and I'm sure it is. If he ever comes to Liverpool, where I'm going to be for the next 3 months, I will definitely try and get there. So we were told of this new audio clip. We haven't actually heard it, of course, that I think Mark features in his show. I think that's why he mentioned it, of the Beatles talking about making a follow-up to Abbey Road, which of course goes against the popular idea that they more or less knew it was going to be their last album. In Anthony Fawcett's book, and people have brought this up, One Day at a Time, I don't know if it's exactly the same dialogue, but there is something along those lines. And really, from talking to Ken McNabb in the earlier episodes 17 and 18, I think they were, Ken and I were talking about the Beatles, and John in particular were very sort of idiosyncratic. They did things on a whim. They changed their story constantly, So it's not really, to me, there could be a revelation, that came out that when they were doing the White Album, they said we can do one more year. It doesn't really change the fact that they did split up when they split up. And I think, kind of being given these little crumbs of information, I think it just highlights more just how sort of creative personalities, and that's a terribly general term, but sort of doing things on a whim and not being always the most reliable people in the world. They were kind of like that, and they, made artistic decisions depending on how they were feeling that day, kind of thing. So anyway, and then the other thing was that obviously Abbey Road 50th anniversary. I bought the CDs, and they had the remix, of course, and then they had one CD of outtakes, and then I sort of scooped up the other outtakes from online. So I've listened to the whole thing, and again, I'm not saying anything new here. If you listen to any Beatles commentators of the last week or two talking about this, they'll sort of say the same thing, that Abbey Road was already a pretty polished album. Arguably, but I'd say most people would agree, it's probably the best sounding Beatles album of their time in terms of the quality of the sound. I think Ken McNabb and I talked about this. I think in the sort of constant revisionism of which is the best Beatles album, I think the White Album went right up the pecking order last year. I think Sgt. Pepper has been down the pecking order for a long time. I don't think the 50th anniversary, it probably raised it up a little bit, but not too much. And Abbey Road was touted by a lot of people as what they think is the best Beatles album. But recently there's been a little bit of revisionism of maybe it's a bit more slick. Maybe there appears to be more there than there actually is, and that the content, the songs aren't as good as perhaps some of the ones on other albums. Anyway, so I listened to this remix, and basically the point I'm making is that maybe it wasn't so much to add. You know, certain stuff did come out. Ringo Starr just sounds better and better with all these sort of isolated tracks you can find on YouTube and all this quote-unquote new material. The remix was good, you know, a few things leapt out. I mean, obviously everybody's talking about the outtake, I'm going to call it, of I Want You, She's So Heavy, where Billy Preston goes nuts on the organ for about 3 minutes, and it is absolutely brilliant. I love it. There's a few things, there was some extra oohs on Oh Darling. Sun King, I think, again, since these isolated tracks come out, Sun King just sounds absolutely sublime. I know it's pretty similar to Albatross by Fleetwood Mac. You know, I wouldn't say it was a rip-off or anything. As I said, they said, let's be Fleetwood Mac doing Albatross for a while, to record this song, and I think that sounds absolutely fantastic. And on the long one, which is the name, their sort of nickname for the medley, and we hear this sort of original conception. I don't really know why everybody's... I heard a couple of Beatles podcasters saying, it's really great to hear Her Majesty in the middle of that. And I mean, okay, you've heard that before. That's been online. You know, there's certain things that I don't concur with. Some of the stuff is sort of glorifying everything. Like, I mean, I have zero interest in Ringo Starr's new album. Sorry to say, you know, I'm not a huge fan of the solo years, although there's obviously a few gems. But, I think there's a certain pathology, you could almost say, about having to scoop up every bit of new material. I mean, last year we had, Egypt Station, and when I heard those first couple of songs, I thought, it's going to be pretty good. There'll be a few good hooks. It'll sound good. And that's exactly what it was. And then, all this collector's edition come out, Japanese edition, all these different versions, colored vinyl. There are going to be people that are going to be scooping all that up. And I really think that's almost, that could be a medical condition to have the need to do that. And talking up that album as if it's a great album. I mean, my friend Owen, who appeared on this podcast, he thought it was a great album. And we didn't argue with that because we were talking about John Lennon. But I don't think it should be made out to be such a great revelation that we have an official version of, something that's been bootlegged for years. You can say what you like about bootlegs. It's one of those topics that we're supposed to frown upon, but everybody takes advantage of. What else was there on Abbey Road? Yeah, I mean, just generally, the bass and the drums. Someone, I think it was Alan Cosin, who I love listening to. I don't know if it was him who said it might be because Paul and Ringo are still alive. The bass and the drums is sounding better, but I don't think that's true. I think he meant it. If it was him, whoever it was, they said, I think they said it jokingly. And I mean, there's no doubt that during the 60s, the bass and the drums did lose out quite a bit on a lot of records. They weren't sort of the sexy instruments, let's say. You'd much rather have somebody letting rip with a guitar solo and put that high up in the mix. So I'm pleased that Paul and Ringo are getting their dues there. So obviously, if I'm still around next year, I'll be talking about the Let It Be film. Very excited to see what Peter Jackson's going to do that. Anyway, so we'll go to the talk with Philip in a second. Just need to tell you that we did have some sound issues. He lives in Mexico, and he told me that the Mexican Skype isn't always the best connection. So for the first 40 minutes of part one of the talk, you will hear an echo coming out of his end of the conversation. Philip came up with a good line, actually. He said that maybe John Lennon would have appreciated that echo, since he used it on a lot of his recordings and never liked his sort of pure voice. Anyway, it will magically disappear at some point during the conversation towards the end, and part two is going to be absolutely fine. So what I'd actually advise is that you listen to the first part until the change without earphones. Because without earphones you can't really hear the echo too much, but on earphones it's quite noticeable. But I did a bit of jiggery-pokery and it doesn't sound too bad. So, the joys of podcasting and all that. What else? So Philip and I, we obviously talk about his book, but at the beginning you'll hear us talking about history and the sort of mainstream versus alternative version of history. And as I told him, I was part of the alternative media, which is very much about questioning official narratives of things. It's very interesting. Just final thing, and then I'll go to the interview, I promise. We didn't mention the word conspiratorial, but I notice in discourse, whenever you talk about something that sort of says, oh, we should love each other more, you seem to have to preface it with a, don't want to sound like a hippie, but... And whenever you try and divulge information that powerful people might want to conspire, get together and hoard information or not tell the masses things or protect their power, you're conspiratorial. And you have to say, don't mean to sound conspiratorial, but thankfully, there's no rules like that on this show. So Philip and I, we get into some interesting stuff because, I'm all for branching out, as you've heard, with going on tangents and all that kind of thing. And that's really the joy of this, apart from all the John Lennon stuff. So we talk about history, like I said. And it was a really good talk. And I'll be back at the end to introduce part 2. Well, I'll talk about something at the end. I'm thinking there may not be an ending, actually, to this one. But so you may or may not hear me at the end this time. Either ways, here's a part 1 of the talk with Philip Kirkland. Enjoy. Hi,
Okay.
Philip. How are you?
Hi, I'm fine, thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, no problem. We got there in the end. We actually talked back in May.
Yeah.
Anyway, so obviously we're here to talk about your book, All Roads Lead to Lennon, which I read back in July. You sent me a copy. I thought before that, since it is basically a history book, not a reference book I should add, it's got lots of great stories in it. Let's talk about history in general for a while, shall we? Have you always been a history buff?
A very good question, because the truth of that is no. I actually mentioned in the intro of my book that when I was at school, I don't know how many of the listeners would be, from other countries or much younger than me, but we had that option. I think it's when you got to 13 years old, that for the next 2 years you'd be studying your O-levels. Yeah.
Options, aren't
Yeah, I don't know whether that's still true, but anyway.
No, I don't think no.
Yeah, we had, various categories of maths and English were obligatory, and from then you had various options. And, well, basically, I didn't take history. It really didn't interest me at that time.
You don't have to tell me your age, but what kind of era were you?
No, it's fair enough. I'm 56, so I'm talking about going to secondary school in the 1970s.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I wanted to ask you actually, what do you remember being taught about our glorious British Empire when you were at school?
Well,
how glorious it was.
Well, first of all, we've got to remember that we're actually going back 40 years. If I go back to primary school, nearly 50 years. So to tell you the truth, it's very difficult. And I don't think that sort of thing, like, celebrating our past was on the agenda. I think it was more general history. But you asked me this question, when we were chatting some time before, and I've been racking my brain to think, what did we study in history? And I really don't remember.
Well, we had, as 2 history teachers I remember, one of them was very sort of studious, and he was great because he had a real passion. The other one was actually a rugby teacher who we think was probably an alcoholic, or at least borderline alcoholic. Quite an old fella, and he would just rattle off a load of random stuff. The one I remember is the Treaty of Unkiar Skilesi, which I've never Googled that in my life to see what that is.
I have no idea.
we just had to copy stuff down, and I think that's why I wasn't really interested in history. I mean, I become a history buff just purely on my own. Really.
Yeah, exactly the same thing happened to me. And even after school, I mean, there are some strange things. I actually had a friend that lived in Bulgaria. She was in England, and sometime after I visited Bulgaria, and she goes through the city saying, this statue, tell me the whole history about this statue and what happened. I'm like, my God, you're female, you're 27 years old. This just was foreign to me that people would talk about that. But I guess that in those kind of countries, because of all the turmoil they had, they were taught those things because they were, I wouldn't say brainwashed, but those things were drilled into them.
Yeah. I'm glad you said that, actually, because the point I was going to make is that basically, if you think about when we grew up, I mean, I grew up in the 80s, really, we were given a version of events. I don't know about you, but I was never really told by anyone that that may not be true. But in the last 20 years, say what you like about the internet, but I was part of a thing that was kind of called the alternative media, which was looking at sort of world events and trying to point out that, now with the internet, people do post links to like books that basically are never given the light of day in the mainstream. And the idea now is the word mainstream now means basically the official version we're given.
Yeah.
Would you agree now that now there is a mainstream version and there is an alternative version?
Yeah. Well, I think that's true for everything now. I mean, okay, I'm getting to that age where I'm getting, very Grinchy, I suppose. But, well, maybe I've always been that way. I don't know. But I think that, I'm a bit of a contrarian as well. So there is a lot of thing that we are supposed to think about the past. It's the regular thing that we are supposed to think. But we all have our opinions. I don't know whether it's always that good to express those opinions these days.
Yeah, I mean, my podcast is obviously about John Lennon. I take opportunities basically to talk about other stuff, slightly branch off, because I think, well, I don't have an editor, I'm not making money off it, I can do what I want basically. But I also have a blog, and I've appeared on somebody else's podcast on a few occasions to be able to talk about this kind of stuff. But even with the Beatles history, like any story, there's a mainstream version, and I've just been reading actually on Facebook some people talking about Colbert's interview with Paul McCartney.
Yeah.
And my issue with mainstream, well, basically the mainstream version of the world, it's very, very softball, and I haven't even seen it, but from what people have said, Colbert's just feeding Paul McCartney these old stories. Oh, I heard you dreamed yesterday. Oh, tell me the story about Helter Skelter.
Maybe it's about ratings, no? I don't know.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure, yeah. But I think in other ways with history, it can... I think it's a bit too much of a tangent because I want to get onto your book. But the point I was going to make is that it can also be used as a tool. There's no doubt about it, to give a version.
The interesting point about that is that that basically is my point of view when writing about the Beatles stuff. It's that there are a lot of opinions about what happened. Now most of us weren't there. Most of the people involved in this, even, I know we mentioned him many times, but I guess he's a yardstick is, Mark Lewison. He was born in 1958. So in the same way, what I'm looking at and what a lot of people I know are looking at is not, the tittle-tattle, not the what you think, why did that happen, etc., etc. It's the facts, and I think as a historian, first of all, you have to get the facts right, and they are not always right. It's not the writing so much, it's the research. That for me, that is the most important thing. The actual writing can become a bit of a drag, but getting the facts right is what's important to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, with Mark Lewison's book, the Tune In book that came out in 2013, I kind of took that as a gospel. I believe most of it, because obviously you probably know how stringent a researcher he is. Yeah. And I just talked to David Bedford, and there's quite a few things, the Pete Best versus Ringo issue. And David Bedford, I guess, coming from Liverpool, perhaps feels that he does have more of a connection. But as you said, you are looking at it from the outside.
Even in his book, I don't say it's treason to say it, though, but there are errors and omissions. And he will probably admit as much that, it's not perfect. It never can be. There's always more to find. One of the things that I'm happiest about is that I have taken some of his stories and I have found more, which is the magic moments, let me tell you.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure. I mean, I think with him, because he takes so long to write them, and I don't mean that in a bad way, I mean, he's very, very, very thorough. I would go crazy if I wrote a book and thinking, oh, God, what's someone going to find out that I've got wrong? But was there a point when you were writing kind of think, I'm going to go with this? You have don't you?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you try to double check things as much as possible. One of the frustrating things is, and it's happened, I'm actually working on a project now. I'm not going to say too much about that, but I'm working on a project and I'm getting conflicts. And you say, well, what's the reason for that conflict? Everything else ties up, there's so much in favour. I guess it's just like a lawyer, the lawyer can never, and the judge can never be 100% certain, even given all the evidence. But at one point he has to say there's too much evidence in favour, therefore it's near enough. We have to go with it,
Yeah, and of course, those kind of decisions could be affecting someone's life, like in the days of capital punishment or giving someone a jail sentence. The stuff in your book, I don't think there's anything that's particularly going to scandalise anybody.
In the book, there's one chapter that involves indirectly people that are still alive.
Oh, yeah.
It's important because the stories have been written before, and I have read, having found what I found, that is not true. So therefore, I think, having found out the facts, I would like that to be known, the real facts, the correct facts. Funnily enough, just before, coming on to do this interview, I was looking at my memories in Facebook. And I came across one that I did, I think it was 6 years ago, that obviously I got from somewhere. It said, the secret of success is doing your best and hopefully somebody will like it. But by the other side of that argument, then somebody won't like it. You do something publicly, that's going to happen. So,
yeah, you could flip that the other way and say, you found something interesting when it upsets somebody. So.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, but I wouldn't be the first to do it, so
No.
People that have done it before are well regarded, so I say, well, as you always say, what's good enough for them is good enough for me. Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about the book. And so All Roads Lead to Lennon. I was saying, I read this a couple of months ago. I absolutely loved it. I think with me, I didn't want to go off on another tangent and ask you which historical period you found the most interesting, but for me, I'm just going to say that I would say the last 100 to 200 years, I would say the most interesting for me, because they're close enough that you could have some idea of what life might have been like, but they're far away enough and things are different enough that it's fascinating,
I agree with you 100%. It's like, for example, people are interested in the Egyptian history, and Egyptian history doesn't have too much relation to our life. So I would agree with you, 18th, 19th century maximum.
Yeah. It's personal taste. I was just going to say the same, actually, with ancient Rome and ancient Greece. To some people, it's fascinating, and I can see that why. But I just love, I don't know, particularly like the 30s, the 40s, because you see those old newsreel movies, and everything's moving at 200 miles an hour, Yeah.
18th, 19th, 20th century for me, that's the most important period because it's the start of the modern era.
Absolutely. I'm also fascinated with the Titanic, and I wrote an enormous blog post about that, and I'm going to be interviewing someone from the Historical Society. And that's absolutely fascinating because that story is so far-reaching in terms of society, but the circumstances around it are different enough. It's just over 100 years that you can kind of look back on it and be fascinated just by the differences as well, but then you can still connect with it. That's the point I'm making.
Exactly.
Anyway. So I'm going to ask you some standard questions now. So when did you get the germ of the idea for your book, and how long did it take to write it?
It's a relatively recent thing. All my life I've been interested, in the Beatles. I have a sister who's 10 years older than me, so she was listening to the Beatles at the time. And I remember sort of the late 60s, and I actually remember, although I was very young, I still remember, I still remember hearing Get Back when it was a current song, for example. So, around that time. So I was only like 6 years old. Little by little, I learned a few things through the year. But it was really only in the past sort of 4 or 5 years that I got into it in a very, very deep way. And it started, with studying what I missed that maybe other people have been interested in the detail a lot longer than me. And it sort of evolved little by little until I found out that the thing that really interested me was the beginnings. Everything else is very, very well documented. Some people say, over-documented. So perhaps during the last 3 or 4 years, I've been researching, and I started getting, so much information of the early stuff that I started a blog. And I got some positive feedback. So maybe 3 years ago or so, a couple of people suggested, that why do you put this into a book? And I thought I didn't have enough at that time. So I kind of put it into a book, sort of pasted all my blogs into a Word document. And I said, well, let's take each story and let's do some research. Let's see what else I can find to expand this story. And so it kind of evolved until the point I thought, well, yeah, there is a book here. The research, I would say, is over, a number of years. The writing, maybe, I think I started about this time last year, and I published in about May. So I suppose in terms of the actual writing, and then of course you're still researching while you're writing. How can I expand on that point more? What information can I get? So I don't know. October to May is what, about 7 months, 8 months, the actual writing. But the research, I would say, is something that evolved over a certain amount of time, plus the research I did during the writing process.
Yeah. I guess there's a question I ask a lot of people who are involved with Beatles stuff. Why John Lennon in particular? Was there anything you found more fascinating about him?
That's an interesting question, because I've actually been accused, of being Lennon fanboy. Why not McCartney? Why not George? Why not Ringo? I identify with the character of John Lennon. That's true, and his humour. And one thing particularly about him, his wordplay. I mean, I'm fascinated by language, and I think his books were absolutely brilliant.
Oh, yeah, me too, yeah.
Yeah.
Right, and Spaniard in the Works, yeah, great.
But that is not the reason. The main reason is that when I started doing the blog, it just seemed that everything, if I may put it this way, led to Lennon.
Oh, very good.
All roads led to Lennon. And when I started researching, putting all my blogs into a Word document and sorting them out, I said, but there's a hell of a lot of Lennon here, not so much of the others. And then when I started researching again, I noticed that I could find a lot of information, I mean, you will see I have, the Lennon line, the Stanley line, and there's so much information to be found on those people. And also very fascinating lives. I mean, the great uncle, the priest, William George Lennon, fascinating life. And that was the point of the book. It wasn't, this isn't a biography of John Lennon. It's a biography of the people that influenced him in some way, whether it be his family, his teacher, his manager, his, whatever, even the places, I had a bit about being for the benefit of Mr. Kite, about Strawberry Field, the history of the people. I wondered if I was going off on too much of a tangent. But then when you find, the people who lived in Strawberry Field before it became a children's home, and you start researching their lives, incredibly, each of those people had a fascinating life themselves. So in that way, I guess, some people are interested in the Beatles, they're interested in the music, the instruments, whatever. I have found enough people who say anything, and the history is fascinating. So we think alike in that way, or I think alike with some of my readers in that way.
Well, I mean, I think what you said earlier, the story's been told and overtold and retold. You've got to find some kind of niche, let's call it.
Yeah.
And I think, I think people who are only interested in the Beatles story, they may not want to know about his ancestors, but I think there's plenty there. And I think, you're basically taking some quite ordinary people, but who've had very, very interesting lives, which is true of, there's millions of ordinary people in the world who've had interesting lives. You've tied it to a figure that is very popular, obviously John Lennon, very compelling.
Yeah.
So you found a way. And I mean, to be honest, having done this podcast, I started in January. I already found John Lennon more fascinating than the other three. But I think it's just been more and more reinforced. I mean, I just talked to Ken McNabb, who did a book called At the End, which is about 69, and we talked about 69. And Paul was a very interesting character then. George was quite interesting, Ringo was quite interesting. But the more books I read, I kind of find the other three were relatively normal. I remember one of our conversations, you're talking about the Rolling Stones. We might get to that later. Why is nobody interested in their ancestry? I find Keith Richards quite interesting, Brian Jones. I find Mick Jagger a very bland character. I'm not really interested to know that much about him. So there's this thing, I think I've kind of talked to people about what is it about John Lennon. I think we decided it was the contradictions, and it was, this ability we have to identify with him.
Yeah.
Well, hard to define, isn't it, really?
Talking about this fanboy thing, tell you something, which again is an unpopular view, but it's a very common view, is I'm interested in John Lennon as a person, as a character, but I kind of switch off in about 1966, like a lot of people do.
Really?
He changed, I'm sure the same John Lennon was underneath, but for obvious reasons, he changed. So it really is the teddy boy, the rebel. I suppose in some ways he was always a rebel throughout his life, but it was that anti-establishment, anti-everything character, when he was young. I listened to your interview with Jude Sutherland Kessler, and she mentioned something there about when John Lennon was killed, he was growing up. You remember that point she made?
Yeah.
He said he was on the point of growing up. I think that possibly he grew up before that, but probably we never wanted John Lennon to grow up. We identified with the rebel in him. They couldn't care less, John Lennon, that of course he started caring about this, that and everything after that period I mentioned, Just to say that, the reason is not being 100% fan of John Lennon. It is because there are so many stories to tell.
Yeah. Just to address a couple of those points. When I have guests on the show, I don't tend to challenge them when they have a view that's not quite my view. And I wouldn't say I agreed with everything Jude said. And that's true of a few of my guests I've had. My problem with sort of the end of his life, again, earlier we were talking about mainstream versions. And there's this sort of mainstream version that he came back and he was really happy and everything. And I think there's a fair amount of evidence to say that he wasn't happy at all.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And that, in fact, I know that, Albert Goldman is a figure that when you go on forums and stuff, there's certain things that people don't want to talk about. They don't want to talk about his killer, which is fine, But they don't want to talk about Albert Goldman. They don't want you to mention
No,
it.
absolutely not.
Oh, my God. And I'll be honest, I'm just saying this because it's my show and I can say what I want.
Exactly.
The more I found about it, I mean, there are some silly things in his book that I think are ridiculous. And I don't like the overall picture he painted, but little bits are coming out that do seem to ring true of the darker aspects of John Lennon. You were saying he got less interesting in 66. I would probably say for me it's more like 1970. I think Plastic Ono Band's amazing. But you're right. I mean, I think there's a good case to say that all of the ex-Beatles, when they went solo, they weren't really breaking too much ground with music. I mean, they'd probably done it all. John Lennon had almost gone full circle by 69,
Yeah.
Maybe there wasn't too much more for him to do, He did go a bit blander in the 70s, I'd agree with you.
There are a lot of people who concentrate a lot on the solo years. And although, of course, there is some great music from all of them, it just could not be repeated, what they did together. That's the magic. So.
People would say it's a cliche, but I agree with you. I think it's, greater than the sum of the parts,
Yeah, I mean, of course, there are songs of that period which could be Beatles songs. That's for sure. But if you take the whole body of music as in total, then yeah, it's of course there were some Duff records during the 60s. Not too many. I can't think of too many. Probably some of the earlier ones more than the later ones. But if you take the body as a whole, it's not going to be perfect, but it almost is. Yeah.
Oh God, I mean, I find more and more as well the stuff that you absorb when you're a kid, it just stays with you for life. So it may be that I'm biased, but I find very few Beatles records that I don't like. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I told this story on the podcast a while ago. When I was in Spain, I was teaching a class of 4 sort of middle-aged women who had virtually no English at all. At the beginning, it was really difficult, but we kind of got a bit of rapport and we kind of had fun with it. And one of the things I used to use in my class was music. So sometimes I'd even bring the guitar, but sometimes I'd do songs, and you black out some of the words and they have to listen and fill the words in. And we played Can't Buy Me Love on the stereo, and it just came on, and it lifted the whole room. It's this amazing power.
Yeah, and a lot of those, a lot of people, again, probably I'm contrary in this, they talk about the creativity of Sgt. Pepper, the complexity of the songs of that era. Being a fan of, the early days, for me, they're a great rock and roll band. And a lot of those songs, although they weren't pure rock and roll, they were still based in rock and roll. I think John Lennon himself said something like that we were at our best when we were in Liverpool and Hamburg, and I have to agree. I'd love to have been there. I've seen these polls. Which concert would you like to have been at? So Shea Stadium, the concert on the roof, I don't know. They're listing all those sort of landmark concerts, and my answer is none of them. I'd like to have been in Hamburg,
Yeah, or at the Cavern perhaps. Yeah, they were filmed in '62, but there's a bit missing. We've got these some of these awful home recordings from 1960. Or there's a few gems in there as well. That was just before they went to Hamburg. Then we've got,
Yeah.
I mean, we've got the old stuff. That'll be the day. I mean, that sounds all right. But then we got from '62, we got recordings. But then there's those 2 years in the middle where there's nothing. No Cavern recordings, which is a shame.
Fight of All the Danger is absolute magic.
Yeah, it's a good song, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, I would say, because first of all, it reminds me like those 1920s blues singers with the recordings that were made at the time, that very echoey, sparse sound. The primitiveness of it is just incredible. And the fact that that was written, I think, it's McCartney Harrison, but of course I think Harrison's only in because of his guitar solo, wasn't he?
Yeah, the riff he came up with.
To think Paul wrote that when he was, 14, 15 years old? It's incredible.
Do you know the one they did called You'll Be Mine? It's from the 1960s.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, darling, you'll be mine. And then John does a When I Broke the Toast This Morning. That's actually from a band called the Ink Spots.
Yeah.
You ever heard of them?
Yes, I have, yeah.
Every single song they did is exactly the same. It's got the same sort of soprano, sort of male folk soprano.
My father's era, yeah.
Yeah. I'm a musician as well. I put out third album this year, and it's got like an Ink Spots pastiche I did.
Great.
I was pleased to do, but yeah, great recordings. All right, there's so much. I've got pages and pages of my notes. So if we go through a few. The other thing with the Beatles, so many coincidences. It's so bizarre. Can you tell us the story of the Epstein and Pobjoy?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give a little bit of credit here, a lot of credit, and I give the same credit in my book to a person you may have heard of called Peter Hodgson.
Yeah.
He's a Scouser born and bred. He was the person that really got me into this searching for stuff. He would send me stuff by messenger, and I would send him stuff back, and it's like he would give me an amazing coincidence or an amazing moment or an amazing discovery, and I'd send one back. And sort of that competitiveness, it encouraged me, it inspired me to do more and more research. Although he's more McCartney and I'm more Lennon.
Oh, well, that's good, yeah.
But no, what happened is that he sent me a cutting from a newspaper which was about Isaac Epstein, the grandfather of Brian. In 1915, he put in, I can't remember which paper, it was one of the Liverpool papers. He posted an announcement in the paper because with his surname, he was accused of being German. In fact, the name does have German origins, but as is well known, they were Lithuanian Jews. At that time, a lot of people suspected of being German were being targeted in many cities, and overall in Liverpool, because Liverpool, being a port and so on, is also quite well known, is that Isaac Epstein set up Epstein and Sons, which later became North End Music Stores, NEMS, which was then commandeered by Brian for his NEMS Enterprises, for his entertainment business and so on. And yeah, he'd established that shop by 1915, so he was well established, maybe 15, 16 years. He was in danger of being targeted. They would throw things through the windows of the shop and loot the shop and so on. It hadn't happened to him as far as I can see, so he decided that he would put an announcement to say there was a £50, a lot of money in those days, for any information that people could give him leading to, apprehension of people that were throwing these accusations at him of being a German. That story goes on, whether it was or not, I don't know. So, talking of this competitiveness, I was absolutely amazed that I was searching at the same period that I found another paper cutting, which was also offering a £50 reward, and it was a guy by the name of Pobjoy, William Henry Pobjoy. So, people that know the story, John Lennon's story pretty well, that's sort of a ding, Yeah. Pobjoy, that's not a common name. Pobjoy, that was his headmaster at Quarrybank, or at least in the last year. So I check again, and these two announcements are, I think it was a day or a couple of days apart. So I don't remember all the details of what I wrote.
That's all right. Get people to read it.
It was a day or two apart, and so hold on. I look at the census and tell them, where was Pobjoy's shop? But it was in Walton Road. And so was, Epstein's shop. And then the brain starts working overtime, So these guys knew each other. Well, I think it was quite possible now. 2 traders in Walton Road. It's entirely possible. Of course, we will never know. As you mentioned, coincidences, what a coincidence. Or was it a coincidence? Did they know each other? Was Pobjoy inspired by Epstein? Of course, what I didn't mention is that Pobjoy was the headmaster's grandfather in the same way that Isaac was Brian Epstein's grandfather. So suddenly you got an amazing coincidence. And you've also got a good excuse to research the history of the Pobjoy family. Where did his headmaster come from? What sort of person was he? And so, these ideas sort of grow by themselves, And once again, it's not a Beatles book. The story of people involved in that, in themselves, are stories. They are stories which are interesting in their own right.
Just to fill, we always have to remember that there may be people listening who don't know a lot of the stuff that we know. William Pobjoy was John Lennon's headmaster. I think it was the last year, you're right. Something of a progressive. He was...
Absolutely,
saw something in John Lennon. He helped him get into Liverpool College of Art, even though John had failed basically all his exams. So we give him credit for that. He certainly had a role to play in history there. But talking of coincidences, do you know that the Eastmans, Linda Eastman's family, when they were having the bitter boardroom meetings in the late 60s where you had Alan Klein on Lennon's side and the Eastmans on Paul McCartney's side, Alan Klein found out that Eastman's family was originally called Epstein.
Yeah, I think it was common changing, I wouldn't say hiding the fact possibly that they were Jews, or something like that. I don't know. Yeah, but yes, I did read that, yeah.
No, mate.
Yeah. Who was the lawyer? John Eastman?
It was Lee and John Eastman. Lee was the father and John was Lee.
Yeah, I think, I don't know what this is about the Beatles. Maybe everybody has these stories, but...
that's the thing. There could be, to do with the appeal, isn't it? If other bands had the same appeal, I'm sure coincidences could be found there. But
yeah, because everybody wants to know every single little detail. That's the thing.
Yeah, I'm guilty of that as well, but it doesn't seem to ever get old for me. I don't know. I never go to the lengths of... I've never been a sort of fan who's that into merchandise.
No.
Having read Jude's book, there's an amazing number of details, and she's got something like 3,000 footnotes.
Yeah,
if I was writing, I wouldn't go to those lengths, but, good for her, I had a great buzz reading her book.
Yeah, that's a lot of work, let me tell you. I would love to have been able to do that, but then you can justify every single thing you say. We take a lot of what we read in the books on trust, but at least in Jude's case, you can say, well, here is the reference. So, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Let's talk about, I'm going to say Strawberry Fields. I actually found out from your book, tell me if this is right, it was originally called Strawberry Fields, and then Strawberry Field, and then John Lennon's song is Strawberry Fields, plural again. Have I got that right?
Yeah, you can only go by what you actually, read in newspaper reports and things like that. One of the resources that I used a lot to try and identify, where places were, because there are a lot of places, for example, streets in Liverpool that no longer exist. So when you find out somebody lived in that street, you want to find out. So one resource that I use for that is the National Library of Scotland, which has a section of maps. And once you find the place you are, it gives you a number of maps. So, for example, in my case, I can find maps from the 19th century. And they also have an overlay feature, which means you can actually directly compare, which is fascinating. And in one of the old maps of Wharton, where Strawberry Fields is, before anything was built there, it's about 1849 or something, the map was published, and it does actually say Strawberry Fields, which is logical. This is actually something which, amongst the people, I talk to and people who are as, nerdish as I am about this sort of thing, is, what is the correct name? Is it Strawberry Fields or Strawberry Field? And the other thing is, was it called Strawberry Field because of the grew strawberries there? Sounds quite likely, no? So, it was put as Strawberry Fields. And all the references to the first owner of the house, which later became the children's home, it is listed in the census and in the reports as Strawberry Fields. Around the time when the house was sold to the second owner, they put in Strawberry Fields. And so it changes many times. So it's not entirely sure which it is, or whether it's just, error in reporting or whatever. So I don't think we can be 100% clear which it is.
And it was basically a fellow called George Warren who made a
Yeah.
fortune, and he built a mansion in Wilton, and it was exactly 100 years before the song.
Yeah, more or less.
More or
Yeah.
less, yeah. Give or take it.
Of course, I don't think John ever knew that, and we can't be 100% sure. Maybe in the future we can. As part of the project that I'm actually working on now, I do have actually more information, and in fact, been advertising this as the most complete story of Strawberry Fields ever told. That story is actually going to get even more complete. But George Warren was the person who built his gentleman's house. He was a ship owner, worked in the city, also worked in Boston in the United States, because that was the route, and he used his fortune to build that house, yeah.
And was it an orphanage then, or?
What's happened is he built a house for his family. He died about 10 years after the house was built. His wife had actually died almost immediately after the house was built. She was reported as dying at that house, but by my calculations, she could have been there days. I'm trying to work out how fast you can build a house, That's very difficult to say, but she would have been there a very, very short time. So she died in 1870. He died 10 years later, and his son, who took over the business, also took over the house. He got married. His family lived there. Until the time that he died, 1912, the son, his sister, who was actually the oldest, was responsible for selling the house. Obviously, you've read that the next owner was also a man in shipping called Alexander Cameron Mitchell. And one, again, astonishing coincidence, I think it was 1917 as well, there was an ad in the local newspaper asking for an employee for a children's home. And the reference at the end of the ad said, contact the superintendent at Strawberry Fields. And again, I'm like, wow, this was a children's home in 1917. Given that he was a superintendent, it wasn't, a private individual. It sounds like a job in a children's home, no? So I'm assuming then that the house was a children's home, quite possibly because it was during the war, during the First World War. And so there was like a temporary accommodation just for a year or a couple of years for children. Again, we can only go on the information we can find. We don't know for sure. But it looks like, by some amazing coincidence, it was a children's home.
And then I guess John Lennon fans would know that the Salvation Army took it over. That was in 1936.
It was actually sold to the Salvation Army 2 years before, but yeah, it was opened in 1936, yeah.
One thing I thought was amazing, actually, got in my notes here, this is from a couple of months ago when I read the book, the home promoted healthy eating and the idea that nutrition had benefits for mental well-being.
Oh yeah, it would be called progressive these days, no?
Oh, blimey, yeah. I mean, I was going to say, because that's something that kind of hit me. Someone told me that like 10 years ago or something. Do you know that actually your food affects your mood, not only your weight? I think when you grow up watching TV, which seemed to be like most kids,
yeah,
there's so much of a weight obsession, and there's so much of a sort of obsession with like aesthetics, physical appearance. That was amazing. Someone when I lived in Thailand, some wise old man, an Australian who was a teacher there, he said that to me.
So is it true?
No, I would say definitely, yeah. Particularly if you have like intolerances and things.
So they were way ahead of their time then.
Yeah, no, God, yeah. I was quite heartwarmed when I read that.
Yeah.
And with, everyone knows the song, obviously, and Strawberry Fields, the song is really, it's a journey into John Lennon's psyche, and you can't discount the fact that he'd been taking drugs, weed and LSD copiously for about 2 years, and I guess the fact that it was an orphanage, John Lennon wasn't actually an orphan, but he had that sort of sense of loss, I guess. Is there anything else that you found out about the home that could tell us anything about the song, or anything?
No. Again, you see, it's what I was saying earlier, is that once we get into the speculation, to the theories, you are sort of getting out of my realm, Okay, if you are a historian by profession, I suppose I am in a way, but you know what I mean. Somebody who works for museums or for whatever. Then, yeah, I suppose in your master's and your doctorate in history, you are going to start saying, you know, what is the relevance of this point in history? I can speculate, but you know, I am really, really more interested in what happened, you know, and then let other people take their view. But the song, I don't think there's any direct reference to the children's home. I think it's just a basis for spitting out his thoughts. It's not directly related to the children's home, I think, you know, like I say, that's my opinion.
Well, what happened was that Strawberry Fields was intended to be on the next album. And I think it was after he'd written that, then Paul wrote Penny Lane. I think it was after that they had the idea of doing an album about their childhood, which obviously didn't come off. You were saying earlier about we seem to be able to identify with John Lennon. He's got this thing that young lads, I guess, growing up can identify with. And I had a place... I guess when I was a teenager, I was kind of dreamy. I mean, when you start reading about John Lennon, you read about how dreamy he was and everything. It somehow validates it. And I used to have a place that I went to, you know, when life was getting hard, as it is when you're about 12. I had a place called Green Lane, and I used to go there, and it became my magical place. I don't think the song had to be that place. I guess it obviously has a great ring. It's a great name, Strawberry Fields, you know. You were saying about wordplay. Obviously, John Lennon's famous for that, and I guess to get hung about something is to get stressed about it. You can also say like bunk, because they used to bunk over the wall, of course. Say, oh, that's nothing to get hung about, or meaning nothing to get hung for. So
yeah, like I say, for me, all speculation, you know, or nothing borne out in fact. So that's where I sort of get lost. The John Lennon philosopher bit, you know, it leaves me cold, you know.
Yeah, that's for me to do. Yeah, start reading spiritual significance into everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I thought we'd just have a little interlude between the stories. I noticed at the beginning of each chapter you had some sort of philosophical quotes which were connected with the story. I'm just going to hit you with a few of these because I do like them. The very ink with which all history is written is merely fluid prejudice. We'll give the listeners a couple of seconds to work out who that is. 1, 2, That's it. And it was Mark Twain, wasn't it?
Yeah, actually I didn't write that one.
Oh, right.
That was Jude who wrote the introduction. No, not the introduction, the
foreword.
The foreword, that's the one. Yeah, that was Jude actually who chose that one.
Oh, okay. So whenever you have that kind of sort of pithy quotes, it's generally either Oscar Wilde, Mark Twain, or George Bernard Shaw. So
yeah, she probably chose a clever one than I did.
I mean, that quote sort of fits in with history is written by the winners, doesn't it?
And actually, to me, there is another side to that, I think, as well, that the fluidity. I actually 100% sure what he was getting at there. I don't know your interpretation.
I think, well, the way I interpreted it is it's a bit like sort of the way that the news is a sort of slickly presented bias.
Yeah.
I kind of took it like that. History is written, the winners write it in a slick way to sort of, you know, make it sound very convincing, but it's sort of prejudiced towards them. So I've talked a lot about the news, about how when you watch the news, it's so slick, it's so, you know, well-polished entertainment that a lot of the time until someone tells you to question it, you don't really ever question it. And I went through, as I was saying earlier, I went through this long period of unlearning and questioning things.
Well, yeah, in that sense, yeah, the history, I think a lot of people, do take things as read, no? That so-and-so said so in his or her book, and therefore that's the fact. And in the process of writing this book, there was a lot to unlearn. A lot of things to question. You know, I'm not going to knock down any other author, obviously not, because they did their research. And I can see as well that when you write this down, you get to the stage where you say, well, this is all I have, you know, and then what you're dedicating yourself to later, you find other things. You say, well, I can actually expand that story. So, there is actually no end, you know, we weren't there, so we have to rely on resources that we have, and eventually we find out things weren't the same as they've been written, or they were, but there's much more to it, and so on. So I think that's one of the fascinating things about history, is that it never ends.
Well, I think the other thing with going back to news again, sort of using it as an analogy, is a lot of it is the omission as well. It's not just what you're told, it's what you're not told. And sometimes even what you're not told is sometimes more profound, in fact. Can I just give you a couple more quotes?
Sure.
Back to you from your own book. History isn't about dates and places and wars, it's about the people that fill the spaces between them. Very good. There's actually a great book I'd recommend to the listeners called A Renegade History of the United States. And it's written by a university professor who probably nobody has heard of outside the alternative media, called Thaddeus Russell. And he did a very interesting thing. He tells the history of America through ordinary people, you know, and how significant ordinary people were in terms of shaping America. So I like that quote.
And again, this goes back to what I was saying earlier in our conversation, that there are a lot of things written that are, you know, speculation. They are not the facts. So I think in that sense that the people give us more of a mirror into the times. For example, you know, writing about the ancestors and the ancestors of other people in this story, we get a mirror of the time through the people, through what they did, through how they were considered.
Well, that's a very good segue, because I've got one more quote and then we're going to segue to one of the stories. So, to acknowledge our ancestors means we are aware that we did not make ourselves. It's easy to forget that we are not the first to suffer, rebel, fight, love and die. Which is wonderful stuff.
We are all part of the people that made us now.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So on that note, could you tell us something about John Lennon's grandfather? Because as we'll see later with Julia, we will talk about Julia Lennon. Another fascinating thing about your book is that by looking at the ancestors, you see little insights into what John Lennon's character would be like later. So tell us about those.
Well, the grandfather is an interesting story because this is a well-told story in a sense that it's been told a lot of times, but not well told in a sense that it's accurate.
Oh, right, yeah. Often told.
There are a lot of good reasons for this, but, you know, we've heard things like, you know, the grandfather John, I will call him Jack because he was known as Jack. Mm-hmm. Obviously, he was John Lennon as well. Better to refer to him as Jack because we don't get confused. So, yeah, that he was born in Ireland, you know. This story went around for years, that he went to the United States and was in some sort of minstrel troupe, and he came back with an American wife and started having a family when he would have been about 45, 50 or something, you know. None of it really made too much sense. So it was interesting that the next stage was, no, he was married before, but given the life that we saw afterwards, that he was married to this Margaret Cowley, who was the first wife before the more well-known Polly, that he had all the kids that we know, you know, the uncles of John Lennon. Even so, we still work out that, you know, he was in his 30s when he got married, which again seems unlikely. So the next stage, this story evolved, you know. The next stage was that, thanks again to Mark Lewison, that he revealed in his last large tome, Tune In, that in fact there was a wife before that, which would make Jack about 24 when he got married, you know. So this made sense. And then Mark wrote, what happens at marriage is not known, and that the next 10 years are distinctly foggy. But those words, you know, what happened next is not known, presented a challenge. So I wanted to know, you know, we must know. We must be a way of finding out. And for me, one of the biggest moments of my research was actually finding out what happened. It took a lot of work. I said earlier that I wasn't too interested in ancient history in the Egyptians and so on. I was actually watching a series at the weekend about Howard Carter and the discovering of the tomb of Tutankhamun. There's this moment where he finally enters the tomb. He makes a hole in the wall and he sees all these artifacts inside. And then he goes in there and sees all these wonderful artifacts that were buried with Tutankhamun. And he then finds on the wall there is a sealed wall which he knows behind that wall is the tomb. For him, it's the Holy Grail sort of thing. He leans back against the wall and sighs and something. In a very small way, that was a similar sensation, finding out stuff like that, you know. That is the joy of it all.
Yeah. Did Jack Lennon father 21 children, is that right?
He did.
And
yeah.
if so, how many women was that with?
Well, known,
Right.
This is another thing that the story, I mean, again, I'm not putting anybody down because we do our research as far as we think we can. And as I said, we always find something more. But the story goes that he fathered 16. In fact, no, he fathered 21. And in addition to that, he had a couple more uncles and aunts as well from his father, which wasn't known before. All these things are fascinating to find. But yes, 21. And the incredible thing about this is how many of them didn't survive. Most of them, which is, again, a history of the time.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Could you give us just sort of a brief picture of the 19th century in that case? I mean, we know obviously that after the potato famine in Ireland, a lot of Irish came to Liverpool, including John Lennon's family. Could you give some idea of the conditions that they would have lived in?
Yeah, well, the original place was down there on the docks. There's a very famous pictures of Saltney Street and Dublin Street where
That's right.
They lived in this court housing. The court housing were, living like battery hens, effectively, in very, very small rooms, no sanitation, all the water coming from a pump outside in the yard. It's like a court housing, it's like a court in the middle and all these rooms around, including, some in the cellars, which were even worse. Of course, there was a lot of disease. There were many epidemics in Liverpool at that time. There's one around about that time when the immigrants came, of typhoid, of cholera, those sort of things. And again, at this time when Jack was married to Annie Scally. So, yeah, it was shortly after that I think Liverpool appointed its first health officer to try and deal with these things, which actually is another interesting coincidence because this health officer lived in Seal Street where the famous Blue Angel Club is.
Oh yeah, Alan Williams' club.
Where they auditioned for Larry Barnes for the Billy Fury tour, which they didn't get. So yet another coincidence comes out of this.
I mean, Liverpool is not necessarily a small city, but a small city in that sense. If you compare it to London, because I might move into Liverpool soon, so I'm especially interested. If you think of the town centre in Liverpool, it's actually pretty small. Think about the centre of London.
Yeah, that's true. What's the centre of London? I always ask,
Oh, exactly. I mean, there's just a huge, there's centres of London, It's not one thing.
I'm living here in Mexico, which is built obviously on the Spanish style. Every town, every city has its centre, which has, a square and a church, the cathedral, the government building, etc., etc. We don't really have that in England, do we? So
not so much, no. I feel like Liverpool, there is a sort of centre, and it does feel smaller. It feels more community somehow. So.
Yeah, I think from like St George's Plateau to the Adelphi and down towards the main streets that go down to the river from there. So I think Liverpool does have a real centre. Yeah.
So there we're going to leave it for part one of the talk. I have come back just to say a couple of things actually. Part two will be online. I'm going to say again roughly every 2 weeks. I'm actually moving to Liverpool on Monday for a trial period of 3 months to see how things go. And depending whether I'm working on Saturdays, I'll try and make Saturday the day to get each episode out, to get a little bit of consistency going. The other thing I want to say is that the podcast is now on all the major platforms. The most popular, I guess, still being iTunes, aka Apple Podcasts. If you go to the Twitter page, which is @OnionLennon, and it's capital O and capital L, that's a place where I put the links to all the main, like I say, the main platforms, Spotify, Podbean, etc. And then the Facebook page is Glass Onion JL Pod. Occasionally post stuff other than links to the podcast, but all the links to the podcast are there as well. I've just added a little Easter egg, as they call it, after the outro music. And talking about weird coincidences, as we were, and as I have many times on this podcast, you may well have seen the film that's, I think it has a few names. I think it's called What's Happening? The Beatles in the USA, and then another DVD I bought was called The Beatles' First US Visit, and it was a Maisel Brothers film. And it was when the Beatles came in February 64, and obviously famously did the Ed Sullivan Show, Washington Coliseum, Carnegie Hall, etc. And I think they were on a train, if I remember rightly, or they're in their dressing room, one of the two. And John Lennon's got one of those things, I think it's called a melodica, thing that you blow into with a little keyboard, and you can make melodies with it. hence the name. And John Lennon starts playing something which will be recognisable as something that the Beatles would use as an intro, actually played by Paul on a mellotron on a song that we were talking about today. That's very weird, and even weirder to think of where the Beatles had come and progressed from February 64 to the end of 66, how different they looked visually, how their music had progressed, etc., etc. Anyway, have a listen to that. And so I'll see you very soon. And thanks as ever for listening. Goodbye.
No money down, easy payment terms.
Get in. 8 o'clock, channel 2 and 3. Do you want to follow this? Channel 2. Maybe 5, 6. I have to get on channel 2. Yeah, we're on this thing now in a minute. Ready, fellas? Let's go. We're late.